And so she said that Nimrod really didn't die. Nimrod ascended into heaven and has now become the sun god. Now, in order to make all of this work, Semiramis then made priests of the people, and they made rules and regulations that the people had to follow. And the priest that she put in place then divided up the year into 4 quadrants. The winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, December 25th at the time, the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, and the vernal and autumnal equinoxes, the days of the year of equal daylight and equal darkness. Winter solstice, summer solstice, vernal, autumnal equinox. Amen. And so the priest of Easter put in place this entire religious system in which now Nimrod is worshipped as a god. Now, quite a while after Nimrod was dead and ascended into heaven, according to this Babylonian sun worship tradition, Semiramis became pregnant. But not in the way that most people become pregnant. She said that the rays of the sun, her dead husband Nimrod, has impregnated her, and now she is going to give birth to Nimrod, reincarnated as the sun god upon the earth. And when he was born, they named him little baby Tammuz, and he was born on December 25th, the time of the winter solstice on the ancient Babylonian calendar. Now, little baby Tammuz was supposed to be the reincarnated sun god, and you would expect that if he were really a god, he would be able to live forever, right? But that's not the case. Little baby Tammuz turned into a man, and in his 40th year, he was gored to death by a wild boar, a pig, in a freak hunting accident, and he was killed. And so the worshipers was killed. And so the worshipers of the sun god then set aside 40 days of weeping for Tammuz, 1 day for each year of his life. And in these 40 days of weeping for Tammuz, they would start out with this wild party the day before, and then they would have 40 days in which they would deny themselves a pleasure in this life for the pleasure of Tammuz in his afterlife. Now, what happened at this period of time is that Yahweh looked down to the earth and saw what was going on the earth, that men were all of one language. There was all sorts of perversion that was going on. These people were worshiping Nimrod, the reincarnated baby Tammuz. I mean, it was a mess. And so what happened at that time is that he looked down and saw that if everyone stays of the same language, there is no amount of evil that's going to be held from these people. You know, they are going to bear totalitarian rule over the entire earth. Everyone will be enslaved. Everyone will be completely polluted with the worship of these false gods. And so he made a decision to confuse the languages at Babel. And so Babylon became known as the word for confusion. Now, when he confused the languages, he many years later made the statement that he confused the languages so that he would, and he divided the nations according to the number of the sons of Israel. Well, at the time that he confused the languages, there were no sons of Israel. They were not going to be born for hundreds of years. But what he was telling us is that he confused the languages. He divided up the one world global empire of Nimrod, scattered the people because he had a plan that he would choose a people who would be his priest, who would be his prophets, who would be his spokesman to the entire world. And until they arrived on the scene, the best thing that could be done is to confuse the languages of the people and send them scattered throughout the face of the earth, and they became known as the 70 nations that came out of that confusion of languages at Babylon. Now is where the story gets interesting, because now all these people have gotten all of this intricate worship pattern that they learned from the priest of Nimrod and Tammuz, and the languages were confused, and so they were scattered all over the earth. And that's why when Israel was in Egypt, we worshipped Ra right along with the Egyptians. We got polluted just like the Egyptians did. We ate what the Egyptians ate. We smoked what the Egyptians smoked. We lived in the fairy tale dream world of the pagan gods that they manufactured. And the main god of Egypt was Ra, who was born on December 25th. Now, we leave Egypt and we go through the land of the Moabites. We're right next to where the Ammonites live. We're to go in to take over the land of the Canaanites, and we find out that all of their gods were born on December 25th. Moloch, Chemosh, and Tammuz. Many years later, the Greeks came in and occupied the land of Israel, and they worshiped Jupiter and Zeus, who were both born on December 25th. Later, the Romans came in and took over the land of Israel. They worshiped Mithra, who was born on December 25th. All of these things have to do with Babylonian sun god worship that came right straight out of Babylon, but was confused by the names of the gods because the languages were confused. But the worship ceremonies stayed the same. So now, let's go back to Chemosh and Moloch. Because we remember from the scriptures, remember that Ruth, she was a Moabite, and she worshipped the gods of the Moabites. She worshipped Chemosh, the god of the Moabites. And we see that the worship of Chemosh went something like this. And all we have are the records and the traditions that have remained in the cultures that we now see today. And so a lot of these things, like Semiramis, Nimrod's wife, in some cultures she's called Beltis. But it's the same person. It's just that the languages were confused. And so a lot of these traditions are still embedded in the cultures of the East. And so what I'm about to tell you is like a composite of what we now know, and we can go back to those times, and we can go back to these cultures and see how they did their child sacrifice and how they did their worship. So let me tell you a little bit about Chemosh. Chemosh was a cast iron, pot-bellied god. And because it was an agricultural society, and the people believed that their crops for the next year, of which they depended upon to live, were dependent upon the blessing of these gods, they would go so far as to make long lists of what they wanted in the coming year, and they would write down these long lists to present to their god Chemosh. And then at the time of the winter solstice, this is when they would present their long list of their wish list to Chemosh, and they would present it to him, but they didn't go empty-handed. First of all, Chemosh, being a big pot-bellied cast iron god, they would then, the priest of Chemosh would from the back stoke up Chemosh and turn the entire pot-bellied god into a cherry red furnace. He was completely red from head to toe. And then the people would recite their list as they stood before the cherry red pot-bellied god, who had his hands out like this, and his hands were cherry red, and they would then take their children and put them in the hands of this god and incinerate their little babies in the hands of Chemosh on December 25th. That was called the child mass. Mass means sacrifice. And that was the high day of child sacrifice in which people would put their children in the hands of the cherry red, pot-bellied god of prosperity and give it as an offering to Chemosh for the blessing of Chemosh in the coming year. That is what the pagan sun god worship was about, and that's why Yahweh said, do not learn the way of the heathen, for they've offered their children to other gods. They've burnt their children in the fires. Don't learn how they worship their gods. Do not do these things and learn the way of the heathen and say you're doing it for me. He said it's an abomination.